Good morning to you.
Good morning. Thanks for having me today.
So a major goal of the Trump administration is to close the Department of Education. They say it will reduce waste, increase efficiency. When it comes to higher education, colleges and university students, what exactly does the Department of Education do?
Yeah, great question. They actually do quite a lot. So we spend a tremendous amount of money on federal student aid programs, and those are all administered through the Department of Education right now. So federal student loans are originated, held, and the servicing is managed by the Department of Education. The FAFSA process, the process by which college students apply for financial aid, including Pell Grants and student loans, that all takes place at the department. Historically, we've had civil rights protections managed by the department that has been moved over to the Justice Department. But largely it's this financial and oversight role that the department plays with higher education.
So if the Department of Education were to shut down, what happens to those loans, that financial oversight that you're talking about? Where does that go?
Great question. And that's a question that a lot of us in the field have at the moment. I mean, I'll say, we have heard different ideas about where the financial management of these programs could go. For a long time, I've even advocated that we should probably move them to an agency that's better suited for the role, something like Treasury or IRS, if we want to automate this process. We have heard the secretary indicate a preference for moving the management of these loans over to the Small Business Administration, which also handles a consumer loan portfolio, though it looks a little bit different. But basically, it seems to me like, given the cuts that we've already seen, the reduction in force at the department, it's probably unrealistic to think that the financial aid programs can continue to be managed at the department. And then, not even mentioning yet that the department oversees the accountability standards for colleges, those accreditation and the new accountability standards that just came from the new reconciliation legislation, the big beautiful bill that put new standards on colleges and new data requirements that the department would need to manage and oversee. So it's definitely in a moment where it's not clear to me how all of that will continue to get done given the current staffing levels at the department and the plan for the trajectory of staffing.
And I want to come back to the accountability standards in just a second,
Yeah.
but staying on loans for right now. Now, there's $1.7 trillion in outstanding federal student loan balances. Some 43 million student borrowers are out there across the United States. Is the Small Business Administration able to absorb numbers of that size, a $1.7 trillion loan balance that they have to handle?
I mean, my guess is no, but to be honest, I don't think our current Department of Education or even the Department of Education before these reductions in force had the capacity to manage that. I mean, this is essentially operating at the scale of like a large consumer bank at this stage. And so in my mind, that's really part of the problems that we've seen with the administration of student loans. And I think that absent some legislative fix that puts in place some spending and infrastructure to manage this scale of a loan portfolio, I do think that we're going to continue to have problems with mismanagement. And so, that was a long answer, but short answer, I don't have a lot of confidence in the plan to move to SBA, which is kind of the only indication we have at this point of where the administration would like to go with this.
This might be another long answer, but how did we as a country accumulate $1.7 trillion in student loan debt?
Yeah, good question. So people always throw out that number like this is like a horror story. We've got 1.7 trillion and like outstanding student debt. Think of all the victims, the people. But the flip side of that, I feel like I have to point out as an economist is that, for a long time, we've celebrated higher ed in this country because it's tremendous investment that pays dividends for people in terms of improvements in lifestyle, increases in earnings opportunities. And so we celebrated higher education and encouraged more and more people to go. We created programs that allowed them to borrow, not by accident, but because we believed that these were investments in human capital that paid dividends both to individuals and to themselves. So there's absolutely problems that we need to solve with student loan affordability, college affordability. But I think that we can look at that number and say, we got here in part for good reason, which is that we wanted a country that was more educated. Then the flip side of that is, okay, is this number really the number that we want? And is there an alternative system of financing that would have us in a moment where student loans plays like a less pivotal role in the financial lives of young people? And I think that's the debate to be having.
Beth Akers is our guest in this 45-minute segment of the Washington Journal. Go ahead and start calling in. We have a special phone line for college students as we talk about the Trump administration's higher education policies. 202-748-8003 is that number. Otherwise, phone numbers as usual: Republicans 202-748-8001, Democrats 202-748-8000, Independents 202-748-8002. As folks are calling in, Beth Akers, can you come back to what we mean by accountability standards and what happened with the One Big Beautiful Bill?
Yeah, so a really important function for the federal government in higher education is to ensure that higher ed institutions, that is college and universities, are delivering a quality education. And I mean, we could debate all day what quality means, but there is a responsibility to make sure in some sense that a quality education is being delivered. And that's because the federal government is the primary, the largest consumer of education. Tremendous amount of taxpayer dollars are going into the system. And so they need to make sure that this is supporting institutions that are doing good things for our country, that are doing good things for young people, and also the fact that so many Americans are spending so much of their livelihoods on making this investment. There's a consumer protection angle to this as well. So when I say accountability, basically it just means making sure that colleges and universities are meeting a particular standard. Historically, when we've talked about accountability and quality at institutions, I think it was a bit more of a fuzzy idea, the idea of what is a good education. We've talked a long time about higher education makes people better, better participants in the democracy. It improves their standards of living. There has been a shift in the past decade, I would say, towards embracing this idea that those things are great, but the baseline is that higher ed needs to deliver financial returns for people who make these investments. And so we have seen incremental creeping policy changes moving in that direction, even starting with the Obama administration, which first published data on earnings outcomes by major, by institution for every program that participates in federal student aid. So then to come back to your question, the Big Beautiful Bill basically makes a big step in that direction and says that in order for programs of study, undergraduate and graduate, to have continued access to student loans for their students, they need to prove that they are essentially doing no economic harm to their students. That is, that they end up on the back end better off financially than when they started. The way they do that for undergraduate programs is say graduates of your program need to be out earning the median high school graduate in your state, for a period of time in history. And if you start to fail that metric, your students can still get Pell Grants. The program can go on. Maybe you can go find some philanthropic dollars to replace it, but we're not making student loans to your students anymore. And so this is a really big shift in the way that we think about what colleges owe students, what colleges owe to our country. And so while it's in fact a low bar in a way, if you think about it, that really graduates only need to do better than someone with just a high school diploma in the labor market, it actually marks a huge shift in the way that we think about what colleges and universities owe to us for all of the funding that goes into that sector.
Is there such thing as an academic blacklist, a list of universities that the federal government has said federal student loan dollars cannot go to this university?
So not quite yet. I mean, historically, we have had a bar in place that was called the cohort default rate. If so many of your students were just not being able to repay their student loans, that the rate of non-repayment was above this threshold, those colleges would get kicked out of the program. Sometimes there were appeals and institutions were allowed to stay in the system. But historically, we've had institutions, not programs, kicked out of eligibility for federal student aid. Now we have yet to see a full implementation of what these standards are going to do for loan eligibility, and it will take a bit of time to accumulate the data for these standards to actually go into practice. So we don't quite know yet where this bar, this standard is going to be binding and causing students and to lose access to those federal aid dollars. I mean, ideally, in theory, this is the lowest performing programs of study, the places where people are going and ending up empirically worse off than when they started in terms of what their earnings opportunities are. So, I don't think we should be in the business of deciding which programs are great or awarding, the highest earnings majors and institutions, but this is really just clearing out the very bottom. If your institution has programs that are delivering people into real financial hardship consistently, that's where we're going to see those cuts. I think we will see community college programs, some for-profit colleges, subject to these constraints. And of course, the problematic result of this is that programs like social work, like education, may be the ones where we're likely to see access to loan dollars cut because of those being traditionally low-paying occupations.
Let me get to some of those calls, and there are plenty for you. Brandon is up first out of Huntington Station, New York. Line for Republicans. Good morning.
Today. I'd like to just have the Beth address during the Obama administration, the federal government started taking control of these loans, college loans, and basically took the banks out of the picture. And since there was really no oversight by the federal government in allowing these students to get bundles and bundles of money over 4 or 5 years, it kind of gave the universities the authority to just ask for more money for tuition year after year after year. And don't you think it might be a good idea to get the government back out of the loan business and more or less moving it over back to the banks, who can determine if that student, they'll put a ceiling on that amount of money. And since the colleges know that, the money's not going to be as cheap as it was, it might also have them reduce the cost for these students, because at 18 years old, they're going to say, Mom, Dad, I'm going to get a good job when I come out. But I don't want to prolong it. But can you just discuss that a little bit?
Brandon, thanks for the question.
Yeah, really great question. So a couple things in that question. So first, it's been kind of a policy decision to say that, when we look at consumer credit typically, if you want to buy a car, you want to buy a house, you go to a bank, you go to a consumer lender and say, can I borrow $500,000 to buy a house? Can I borrow $30,000 to buy a car? The bank is going to look at you and ask one question: can you afford this loan? We do not do that when it comes to federal student loan programs. That's just been a policy decision that has historically been in place. The idea is that if we were to do that, the students that are most economically disadvantaged to start would be the ones to lose access to credit. And it's just been a decision that in terms of providing access more broadly, this is something that we're going to do. You could debate whether that's the right decision or not, but that has been the case. So when it comes back to this shift that the caller is talking about, it is true that during the Obama administration, private sector participation in federal student loans was eliminated. And so I should say just before that, I was an economist with the Bush administration where we implemented legislation to try to keep the private lenders participating in the program, because I think there was some good to come of that. But it's not exactly the good that I think the caller would like to think or has imagined. And it's that when private lenders did participate in this program in the past, they were not doing the kind of underwriting that we know private lenders do in other consumer credit spaces. So they had to operate by the exact same standards that were in place for the government side of the program. So it was not as if Citibank was coming in or Sallie Mae was coming in and making loans and, being critical and saying, okay, I'm not going to give you this loan because I don't think you can afford it. Instead, they were using the exact same rules as the federal side of the program. So it was almost like a private loan program in name, but not in practice. None of the benefits of privatization were actually in place because of that. I absolutely think it's true that when you give colleges this unlimited access to credit without an underwriting process, you risk them running up the cost because there are, not these underwriting practices that put pressure on institutions. And I think the change that we saw from the reconciliation legislation to eliminate uncapped borrowing for graduate students actually really reflects our newfound understanding of how this has been happening in that space in particular. Some new research in the last few years has shown that colleges have almost increased their prices dollar for dollar with the expansion of access to credit for graduate student programs. And so I think the shift we will see because of the pretty aggressive caps that were put on place through this new legislation is the private sector will likely step in and pick up some of the slack, but they will only pick up the slack in places where these are programs of study that deliver good outcomes, and they're likely to get their dollars repaid because, like the caller said, if, you're going into a program of study that doesn't look like it's heading towards an occupation that's going to give you a good financial return, a good earnings to be able to repay back those loans, private lenders aren't going to give you the loan. And while that has, problematic implications for equity, I think that it also is an important consumer protection. So I think it's a good direction for graduate student lending. I think we could definitely benefit from some of those aspects being introduced for undergraduates as well.
That line for college students, Ethan is in the Steel City of Pittsburgh. Good morning. Thanks for waiting.
Hello, thank you for taking my call. I guess the main thing I wanted to just talk about was, I hate how this whole administration and MAGA movement has hated on professors as if they're the main issue and we need to get rid of all professors. They're poisoning our kids. When the real issue and part of the reason why loans have ballooned up is these administrative fees have absolutely gone huge. Their salaries are ginormous. Go to a small school in Pittsburgh where, hundreds of thousands of dollars have gone to upper administrative, where professors, have to get up a second job just in order to pay the bills. And therefore, we're set to foot, and they look at their job too. Us college students are here to foot the bill for these people, just sucking at their job pretty much. And that's why we have tens of thousands of dollars of student debt.
Beth Akers.
Yeah, when you look at the data on where colleges are spending money, it's hard to really put the blame on any specific aspect of their business model as really driving the increase in cost that we've seen over time. I like to say, the reason that prices have increased is because students are willing to pay it. And that's not to put the blame on students. I think students are willing to pay it because we have had this rhetoric in this country that really the only way to access the American dream is by having that college degree. It's the house, the white picket fence, and the bachelor's degree diploma on the wall. And I think when you tell someone the only way to be successful in this country or the only way to be adequate is to have that degree, people are willing to pay any price, especially when we've made the credit available and The process of paying for college is really opaque. I think students often don't even know how much they're paying, unlike the caller, who sounds like he's really well informed on his financial position. But I think that, we've pushed too far in that direction. And Pete Buttigieg once said many years ago in a Democratic primary debate that we need to make it affordable for people not to go to college in this country. And while I don't often agree with Pete Buttigieg, I agree with him in that instance. And affordable to not go to college, but also socially acceptable and celebrated to not go to college, because I think that empowers students, puts more power in the hands of consumers, and takes this power away from institutions to continue to increase prices year after year. And I would agree that it's not the faculty for sure. There's a lot of hardworking faculty out there, not necessarily getting rich doing that job. So I think the caller is right in that respect.
Dubuque, Iowa. James, good morning. You're next.
Hi. I think one of the most prescient things that Ronald Reagan ever said was that the most feared 10 words in the English language are "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." I think we need to get back to the free market. If I'm not mistaken, I think that the largest asset on the federal assets is questionable, to be charitable, questionable student loans. And I think our system is bankrupt. We have $38 trillion in debt and hundreds of trillions of dollars in unfunded obligations, and the system is collapsing. Some of these colleges have more administrators than they do professors, and this system is non-functional. As soon as the government got involved, just like in housing, it's the same issue in housing. When the government gets involved, there's no problem the government can't make worse. Let's put it that way.
Beth Akers.
I think I appreciate the comment. I think that in theory, there is a place for federal intervention in student lending. Even Milton Friedman, sort of the father of conservative or classical economic thought, made the case that the feds should be intervening to make sure sufficient liquidity is available so that we have adequate investment in education, because without it, we may not. And education is so critical to the growth of our country, our international competitiveness, our democracy. But at the same time, I think there have been tremendous innovations in finance since the time that Milton Friedman wrote that in the 1950s. And I do think the private sector could do more. And I'm excited to see that this recent legislation has really clawed back the federal role in graduate student lending. I mean, this was a real racket. This is a place where we had uncapped borrowing, tremendously generous loan forgiveness programs. And so, as the caller pointed out, this program's not working, but I would argue that it's not working, not because in theory we shouldn't have any intervention, but because we've made some really lousy policy choices. I look back on the days when I started doing this work when higher education was not a front page news story most days. And the good thing about that was that it wasn't necessarily being used as a political instrument. And since that has changed, it seems like we have a lot more bad policy coming about as a result. So I think in theory, there's definitely a role. I would like to see us streamline and improve the efficiency of that intervention and experiment in the way that we're doing with the graduate student side of things to see where can the private sector improve this process.
You talk about stories on the front page, two high-profile efforts by the Trump administration when it comes to higher education. One involves combating anti-Semitism on college campuses. Another one is limiting the enrollment of international students at various colleges and universities. What mechanism is the Trump administration using to push for these changes at these colleges and universities?
That's a great question. It's my sense that the Trump administration is really going outside of the traditional processes that are in place for oversight of the sorts of civil rights violations that the administration is charging against these institutions. And so, while I think there is room for improvement for institutions' handling of free speech on campuses, particularly the issue of anti-Semitism. I think the behavior that we saw on campuses following the Hamas attacks on Israel made clear to me, and I think a lot of Americans, that there are some problematic things happening, but there are standard processes for addressing those violations or perceived violations. I wish the administration had taken a more traditional route in addressing them, because I think, this maybe extra legal process that they're utilizing today, I think undermines the argument that there are in fact real issues. And, as I just mentioned, turns it really more into a political commentary more than an effort to fix and sort out higher education.
New York City, Michael, line for Democrats. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for taking my call. The guest made a comment earlier on about taking certain professions. I think she mentioned social work as an example, where folks don't make that much money compared to, let's say, maybe a high school graduate. So therefore, why subsidize those loans? And I'd like to suggest to her that some of us enter professions where salary is not the most important piece. I became a teacher 50 years ago, knowing I'd make much less money than a CEO in a corporation. And the same thing with social workers. So I'm a little upset about the thought of not helping out folks who go in professions that don't earn that much money. I appreciate her comment off the air.
Beth Akers.
Yeah, really great point. So I think this is an issue that's sort of yet to be resolved, because I absolutely agree that our nation needs teachers, we need social workers, and I don't want a regime of oversight for institution that rewards or pushes institutions or students into making investments only in those highest paying occupations. I think that's the wrong direction for policy. I want to be clear that the changes that came from the Big Beautiful Bill actually don't really push us very far in that direction. So like I said, it's the first time that we're putting these standards on earnings in place in a really big, universal way. But it's not saying that more money is better and taking away from people who are choosing lower earnings occupations. It's basically just saying that at a very minimum, these institutions, these programs of study really need to do no economic harm. And I get what the caller is saying, which is that maybe some really important public service occupations get tied up in that. The problem I have is that the system that we had in place before recognized, yes, we need people to go into these low-paying occupations, but we're not going to pay for it as a nation. We're going to basically get people to take on unaffordable debt that we know is unaffordable, so that they are the one who pays the price for this. So the system before wasn't helping people to go into these occupations. I would much rather see that as a result of this, if we do get some shortages of people going into the lower earnings occupations as a result, that we make policy changes that more directly address that. Let's pay teachers more. Let's pay social workers in the public sector more. Create a tax credit, scholarship programs. Let's get institutions to charge less for these programs of study. Find philanthropic dollars to offset the costs in those spaces. There's lots of solutions that are other than what we had in place previously, which was that the individuals, often economically disadvantaged students themselves to start, are the ones who are going to pay the entire price, and often unknowingly. If students always knew what they were getting themselves into, and yet were choosing to go into unaffordable debt to pursue these careers, I think I'd be more comfortable with that. But the data tells us that very often students have really no sense of the trajectory that they're on when it comes to the affordability of student loan repayment. And so to my mind, this is a absolutely critical change from consumer protection perspective. And there may be further changes necessary in order to subsidize, what we perceive as really socially valuable occupations, including teaching, which is, wonderful occupation important to society that the caller participated in himself.
Less than 15 minutes left with Beth Akers of the American Enterprise Institute. You can see her work, her webpage at aei.org. Taking your phone calls about the Trump administration's higher education policies. One topic we haven't touched on yet, how much a year does the federal government give to colleges and universities when it comes to research grants? And what is your view about not just this administration, any administration limiting those research dollars if they disagree with the university's hiring practices or admissions practices or even course offerings? Is that something that is okay?
So a tremendous share of revenue at a lot of research universities is coming from grant support for research. And so the current administration's strategy of basically stopping those funding streams based on a distaste for the political leans of the research or of just practices happening on those college campuses, I think is an overreach and an inappropriate use of the executive authority. I particularly don't like that some of these contracts have been disrupted midstream. I mean, it's one thing if we're going to make a pivot in terms of our strategy for making investments in research at universities, convene a task force and decide that our budget for funding research will be, declining in future years. But I think it's unnecessarily disruptive to take the tack that the administration has taken, which is to, create this financial uncertainty for institutions by disrupting the flow of resources mid-grant in some cases. To me, again, it feels more like a politically motivated commentary on what the institutions are doing rather than a real shift in policy. And so, again, when it comes to whether or not political leanings on college campuses are an appropriate reason for the administration to exert authority and withdraw funds, I mean, absolutely not. I think we of course need to make sure that civil rights are protected on college campuses. Free speech is protected on every college campus. But beyond that, I'm perfectly happy for there to be places where institutions focus on having particular, ideological specializations. I mean, it's fine for me that there's an institution with a largely progressive faculty. If students want to choose to go invest in education there, I think that's fine for them. It's fine for federal resources to support that, as long as on the flip side, there are institutions allowed to exist that, embrace a more conservative philosophy and are staffed according to those principles. I think heterogeneity in our higher ed sector is part of what makes it great and helps it to serve, our country in the best way that it can. And so I worry that we are undermining that heterogeneity or ideological diversity across campuses, through the actions of the current administration.
To the Badger State, this is Alan in Rhinelander, Wisconsin, independent. Good morning.
Yeah, a couple comments that will inform this conversation. The New York Times reported very recently that 2/3 of all student loan borrowers are not making payments on their loans. 2/3. So what are we even talking about here, Beth? This lending program is finished. And by the way, Donald Trump's higher education chief, even before the pandemic, he said that 85% of all student loan borrowers were never going to be able to repay their loans. Now, right now, interest is now restarted on all student loan borrowers. $100 billion a year in interest profit for the Department of Education is being generated and slapped onto our backs. Beth, no offense, but...
Well, Alan, I'm going to let Beth Akers jump in.
Great question. So we know that the Department of Education is in fact not making huge profits off the backs of students. We have a lot of students who are in non-repayment right now, but this is not necessarily reflective of affordability. So if we go back in time, during the first Trump administration, at the onset of the COVID pandemic, President Trump put a pause on student loan repayment. Basically, this was a moment of unprecedented economic uncertainty. And so the idea was, let's just put a pause on something that we can control entirely and not put that additional burden on Americans while we're potentially entering this really dramatic economic downswing. What happened was throughout the Biden administration, as Biden pursued his campaign promise to cancel student loans, up against the Supreme Court restricting him from being able to do that, he basically continued that student loan repayment pause, which allowed borrowers to not make any payments without accumulating fees or interest on their loans throughout his administration. And so it was very near the end of the administration when eventually student loan repayment was allowed to resume again. And so it was asked that borrowers start to begin making those payments. And so, having a few years of disconnect with a lender on any consumer credit loan you have, and then being asked to kind of, jump back on board, I think is going to be a disruptive experience for consumers, regardless of their ability to repay. And I think what we are seeing is we've had so much confusing messaging going out in the media about student loans. I don't think borrowers even know necessarily that they should be repaying their loans, or very often, those who do know they should be repaying don't know where to be repaying. And so, this highlights a real challenge with the status quo, which is that the system is so complex that we're making the financial burden of loan repayment even more challenging through this excessive administrative burden. And some of the changes in the Big Beautiful Bill really seek to streamline the program to move away from that. But I'm hopeful that in the next several months that we will succeed in getting a lot of those borrowers back into repayment, reconnecting them with their servicers, getting their direct deposit or their auto pays signed up again. And a lot of those non-repaying borrowers will actually quickly come back into repayment. During, just recently, the financial consequences like loans going to collections agencies, the effects on credit scores, those sort of went back into effect. So, as borrowers go to maybe buy a new home or buy a car and try to get a loan, they may, get this unpleasant surprise to learn that, in fact, they should have been paying on their student loan. And as those consequences hit, I think we're likely to see people reconnect with their loans and get back into the business of repaying. And I'll add one thing here, which wasn't part of the question, but I think it's important to point out for this audience is, there has been a lot of criticism of the recent legislation from Democrats who dislike that some of the President Biden's repayment plans will go away as a result of these changes. And what's left is, in some regards, less generous than the repayment protections that were previously put in place. But I want to be really clear that anybody who has a student loan today still has access to repayment options that make monthly payment affordable based on how much they're earning. So borrowers with the lowest income can pay as little as $10 a month. And so, it is not the case that this legislation and Republican leadership in Congress has eliminated the safety nets for borrowers. They've tweaked the parameters. It's slightly less generous for some borrowers in some ways, more generous for other borrowers in certain moments. But safety nets absolutely still exist. So if you're a borrower out there who has a loan, you should be paying, but have concerns about whether or not you can afford to pay back those loans, just know that connecting with your servicer through the Department of Education, there are repayment options available to you that will necessarily be affordable based on how much you're earning.
Time for one more call this morning with Beth Akers of AEI. This is Roy, Cameron, Texas. Good morning. Thanks for waiting.
Good morning. One of the things that I haven't heard discussed, I'm currently a student at Southern New Hampshire University. I'm a native Texan. I started my college, when I started college back again, was in Colorado, and I had to move back to Texas. When I transferred to UT, or tried to transfer with the 4.0 GPA, I had to write 3 essays, and one of the essays that I wrote was on the fact that they wanted me to have 3 classes that did not pertain to my degree. So what are we going to do about these universities that are charging students just oodles of money to take classes that they don't need? My degree is in cybersecurity with a focus in forensics. I don't need chemistry, biology, or calculus. So I think that's something that really needs to be addressed and be. I don't know how it's going to be done, but I think that's one of the big problems. Thank you so much for taking my call, and I'll take my response off the air.
Beth Akers.
Yeah, that's a really good point that the borrower or the caller is raising. This idea of basically the question is, what is education? What does it need to be? And I think big colleges and universities, especially the longstanding ones, have a vested interest in it looking like it always looked. And I think that there is a big push with some of the changes from the current administration, as well as the Republicans in Congress right now, to open up what education looks like. And I think the direction that Republicans at least are moving is to a more career-oriented pathway. And some of the policy changes, like around accreditation policy, which basically sets the bar of what does a degree need to look like in order to have access to aid, those things are changing as a result of some of the decisions from the Trump administration. And there may be more options available for programs of study, institutions as a whole, that look more like the career-oriented, focused pathway to employment that the caller is looking for. And I think that's a good change. Like I said, I think there's plenty of room for the old model, but I would like to see some more streamlined models that maybe take out of some of the, unrelated academic experiences that some students just aren't interested. And I think that's fine. I think we're moving that direction.
Beth Akers is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. For much more on her work and her research, aei.org is where you can go. Beth Akers, thank you so much for your time this morning. Really do appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.